So this webinar is directly an event of the Next UK project, which is co-funded by the European Union and which aims at studying the EU and UK relations and both the history of this relation and also the future. So today I'm really glad to have three experts to explain and to talk about the 2021 Scottish elections and how they are specific as they occur in the post-Brexit process. And so really this lecture, which aims at questioning whether the electoral success of the SNP and Greens in this post-Brexit area could mean or could lead to some disunited kingdom. So really thinking about all these different elements. So I'm very glad, and I would like to thank Fiona, Nicola, and Michael for joining us. So a few words, Dr. Fiona Simpkins is a lecturer at Lyon 2 University. Professor Michael Keating, you're a chair in Scottish politics at Aberdeen University. And Professor Nicola McEwen, you're co-director of the Centre on Constitutional Change of the University of Edinburgh. So we will start with a 10-minute presentation by each lecturer, and then you will be able to react on what others have said, on your colleagues' thoughts. And then we will finally have some time for Q&A, so you can write directly your questions and comments also in the chat, and then I will be able to ask them directly to our lecturers. So I will start with leaving the floor to Fiona. We will have 10 minutes to explain what has been the role of Brexit in the 2021 Scottish results, and what have been and also what could be the relationship between Scotland and the EU. So Fiona, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, of course, thank you very much, Agathe, for organising this event and for inviting me. I'm delighted to discuss these issues with you. Right, well, perhaps I should start with a few words about the election results themselves before discussing the indirect role of Brexit in these results. Right, well, these results, more than anything, appear to have confirmed the hardened polarisation of the Scottish electorate over the constitutional question, as the number of seats obtained by each party has remained very similar to that of the 2016 Scottish Parliament election. So the main contenders were the SNP and the Scottish Conservatives. Now, although the SNP did not focus on their project for a second independence referendum during their campaign, it featured prominently in their manifesto, while on the other hand, the Scottish Conservatives once again led a campaign focused on the Union. So it was therefore quite clear during the campaign that a second independence referendum was the key issue of the election. And it would appear that this issue alone drove more people to the polling stations. The turnout reached 63.5%, which is the highest turnout recorded for a Scottish Parliament election, I believe. So we can suspect that the stake of the election was considered important by voters and probably encouraged more people to vote. Now, the Scottish Conservatives managed to remain the main party of opposition as they held on to a total of 31 seats. And the SNP, on the other hand, obtained one more seat than in 2016, so a total of 64 seats and one seat short of an overall majority. Labour only managed to obtain 22 seats. The Liberal Democrats took 4 and Scottish Greens 8 regional seats. Now, crucially, a certain amount of tactical voting was apparent with unionist voters who preferred to vote for the best placed unionist party in their constituency, and with pro-independence voters as well, who favoured the Greens on the regional list vote. Now, tactical voting occurred in constituencies where the SNP was pitted against one of the main unionist parties in a tight race. Voters appeared to back a candidate from a party they wouldn't normally support in constituencies such as Eastwood, for example, where the Labour vote fell. and the Conservatives were able to hold on to their constituency, or there was a similar pattern in Dumbarton, where Labour were able to hold on to this constituency. So that suggests that the main driver behind votes was indeed the debate over a second independence referendum. Revealingly, the results of the pro-independence parties also correspond more or less to the percentage of people who support independence in Scotland, as evidenced by the latest polls. So this shows a midway split in opinion, which corresponds to the average 50% of support for independence in polls this spring. So although the key issue in the election this month was an independence referendum rather than Brexit, contrary to the general election of December 2019, which was much more focused on Brexit, it was still indirectly related to Brexit. Now, one reason, of course, is that Brexit gave the SNP a chance to reboot its independence campaign by arguing that the circumstances of the 2014 independence referendum had changed, and that Scots should be given a new opportunity to have a say on their future. Now, in fact, there was little appetite for a second referendum at first, and the surge in support for independence which the Nationalists expected after the European referendum failed to materialise really until the summer of 2019. The increase of support for independence between the summer of 2019 and last autumn appeared to have occurred primarily among Remain voters too. And so, well, this suggests that the Conservative government's chaotic handling of Brexit and negotiations with EU member states eroded support for the Union among Remain voters, and that the SNP was potentially able to tap into the majority of Remain voters in Scotland to support them. Now, this was the case in December 2019 when the SNP did well and obtained 48 seats. Now, polls, however, have shown that this surge in support for independence died down this winter as Brexit now became a reality, and concerns about the pandemic and its aftermath took over as a priority. And as I noted earlier, polls this spring have shown that support for independence corresponds on average to about 50%. Now, with the SNP falling one seat short of an overall majority, the debate over whether the SNP obtained a mandate to hold a second independence referendum remains unsettled. In any case, Boris Johnson has remained adamant that he would not agree to a Section 30 order, which would allow the Scottish Government to organise a referendum on Scotland's independence. And in fact, the Prime Minister's attitude to this issue is interesting in the sense that it also shows to what extent Brexit now shapes the debate about Scotland's constitutional position. His strict adherence to a unitary conception of the UK and commitment to uphold UK parliamentary sovereignty above all else is rather coherent with his approach to Brexit, but it is bound to be in conflict with the devolved institutions, because it fails to address the territorial dimension of today's constitution. Perhaps the main difference between 1973, when the UK first joined the EU, and now, with the UK having just left, is the asymmetrical nature of the constitution that was introduced with devolution in the late 90s. And devolution and the Good Friday Agreement were formulated in the context of the UK's membership to the EU. The EU acted as a buffer in many respects when it came to overlapping powers, perhaps making it possible to avoid any contentious questioning of the issue of sovereignty in the UK. The Scotland Act granted the Scottish Parliament with powers over any areas of competence not reserved to the UK government and Parliament, and yet most of these devolved powers, like agriculture, fisheries, environmental protection, or consumer protection, to name but a few, were also exercised at the EU level on a shared basis with the member states. So the Scottish Parliament is therefore directly tasked with complying with EU law, thus avoiding any contentious confrontations over possible overlapping competences in Westminster and Holyrood. Of course, although the Irish question immediately became the key sticking point in the Conservative government's negotiations with the EU in the aftermath of the European referendum, Scotland's political singularity could escape nobody's notice, as its 62% majority Remain vote stood out in the electoral map. And in fact, the difference in Scottish voters' electoral behaviour in the European referendum reflects both Scotland's distinctive political landscape and the political weight of the pro-European SNP. Now, the SNP has been very much pro-European since the 1980s, when it adopted a policy of independence in Europe, which appeared to assuage many of the fears brought by independence, namely its costs. And so the realisation that a devolved parliament could greatly benefit from its involvement with the EU also encouraged the SNP not only to argue that Scottish ministers should be able to take part in the EU Council of Ministers meetings, but also to support the establishment of Scotland House in Brussels, which promotes Scottish interests and Scottish expertise in areas such as research and innovation or renewable energy, and engages with EU institutions. The Scottish Government also created the post of Scottish Minister for European and External Affairs in 2007, Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, and it established further links between the Scottish Parliament and other devolved governments in Europe, with a number of innovation and investment hubs around Europe, with offices in Berlin, Dublin and Paris, to provide a platform for collaborative activity promoting trade and inward investment. So it's no wonder then that Scotland's full membership to the European Union took on such importance in the debate leading to the 2014 independence referendum, and that the issue has now proved to be a stepping board for a new independence referendum, which the Scottish Government wishes to hold towards the end of this Parliament. And yet, of course, no certainties have emerged from the debate, and both nationalists and unionists base their arguments on really mere speculations as to the process an independent Scotland would have to follow in order to either enjoy continued membership or reapply for EU membership, because there exists no legal precedent for the emergence of a new independent state within an existing EU member state, or now a former EU member state. Now, in 2014, both José Manuel Barroso, the then president of the European Commission, and Herman Van Rompuy, who was president of the European Council, publicly warned that European treaties would cease to apply to Scotland if it were to become independent, and that it would have to undergo a long application process if it wished to join again. Spain also sent mixed messages about the possible threat of a Spanish veto over Scotland's membership in order to avoid establishing a precedent which Catalonia might use to obtain its own independence. But in fact, what appeared most clearly during the independence referendum campaign debate was that it would probably be the result of political negotiations between Scotland, the rest of the UK, the European Commission, as well as the individual member states. Now, to join the EU, Scotland, of course, will have to follow the same application process as set out in Article 49 of the Treaty on European Union as any other potential applicant. But certainly we could say that Brexit has probably changed the way that Scotland is now considered in other parts of Europe.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for all these thoughts about the results, about the relation between Scotland and the EU, and some potential also about this relationship. You started mentioning the independence referendum, so it's perfect for my transition with Michael. So thank you very much once again, Fiona. And I will leave the floor to Michael, with the chair in Scottish politics. And so, as such, what are your views on Scottish independence? Do you think that a new referendum is a feasible option? Under what condition? And is independence at the end really supported by the Scottish electorate?
Thanks, Agatha. I've been spending the last few weeks fielding off questions from the international media who are asking me precisely what you just asked me. What is going to happen? Will there be a referendum? Who will win the referendum? What will be the outcome? And I've answered them, I don't know. I'm not an astrologer or a fortune teller. I'm a political scientist. All I can say is, on the one hand, on the other hand, here are the factors you can take into account. And in this question, there's a political uncertainty, because there's uncertainty about the nature of our own constitution. There's uncertainty about political opinion. There's uncertainty about political tactics that will be used, and there's environmental uncertainty about the relationship with Europe and so on. So multiple variables at work there. And it's really impossible to say what is going to happen, except that there's going to be some kind of conflict. And this really, to understand this, you really need to understand that there are two views of the British Constitution, whether it is a unitary state, whether parliamentary sovereignty is really the foundation of political authority. I've always regarded that as something of an empty doctrine, a little bit of a tautology, a not terribly helpful way of understanding the Constitution, or whether one should see the United Kingdom as a plurinational union with multiple sources of legitimate authority and sovereignty. And I've argued that in that respect, seeing the UK as a plurinational union in which there's the demos, the people, the telos, the purpose of it, the values, the ethos, the nature of sovereignty are all contested. In that sense, the United Kingdom, understood that way, is actually a rather good fit with the European Union, which is precisely that, a plurinational union without agreement about the nature of sovereignty, the ultimate aim, and so on. And so Brexit is therefore profoundly destabilizing to the whole understanding of the United Kingdom, the one understanding of the United Kingdom, and was pushed through on the basis of a completely different understanding, the rival understanding of the United Kingdom, which is that it is a unitary state with a unitary parliament and a unitary people. And that's basically the root of the whole problem we're talking about today. Now, that does translate into different views about whether there could be or should be a referendum and how there would be a referendum. Because on the one hand, the UK government is simply able to point to parliamentary sovereignty and say, we hold all the cards, and that indeed Parliament has said in the Devolution Acts that the Union of England and Scotland is reserved to the United Kingdom. And in any case, even if it wasn't, the UK could override anything that said otherwise. And therefore, this is a matter for the UK Parliament. There's another view, which is that practically everybody in the United Kingdom has long accepted that Scotland does have the right to self-determination eventually. This is not Spain, where there's a constitution and a political class that deny the right of secession. What there's never been agreement on are the conditions under which Scotland might secede from the United Kingdom, except briefly in the Edinburgh Agreement of 2012, which lasted until the referendum of 2014. And there lies the whole problem. But the other view from the Westminster view is that if Scotland does have a right to self-determination, then it follows there must be a mechanism for realizing it. Otherwise, it's just an empty idea. And in a democracy, what more acceptable way of deciding this could there be than an election held under proportional representation, the winning parties then staging a referendum under peaceful conditions, under universal suffrage. Everybody in Scotland under the age of 16 has the vote. You don't even need to be a citizen these days. What more democratic mechanism could there be than that? Therefore, that must be the rule. And as some people have pointed out, if the UK government responds to that, saying, well, we're not going to allow you to do it, they have to give a reason. They can't hide behind the constitution, or this is an indissoluble union, or this is a single people. They have to give a reason. And the reason might be, well, this is not the time, but that begs another question. When would be the time? What are the circumstances under which that would be possible? So as an intellectual argument, this has a limited lifespan because eventually the time will have to come. And by saying it's not the time, of course, they're conceding that there will be a time. That's the implicit idea. So there are these two views of the Constitution. The courts are not going to resolve these. Parliament is not going to resolve these. This is going to be worked out in political competition. We're going to get a standoff then, which could last for quite a long time. And remember, we've probably only got about 3 years to the next UK election. Then the cards will be shifted again. The SNP will not get a majority of Scottish seats again. The Conservatives will not be elected. Add to that the fact that there is a 50-50 split in support for independence and union, and neither side wants to take the risk of going for a referendum now. One can imagine that nobody is in a hurry to force the referendum. COVID is a very convenient excuse to not to do it, but in any case, nobody's in a hurry to resolve this issue, but it will have to be resolved at some stage. Now that 50-50 split on independence and union is a little bit more than the split in 2014 when it was 45-50. And things have indeed changed, as Fiona was saying, since the Brexit referendum. Notably, that the support for independence now increasingly corresponds with support for Europe, which it didn't even in 2016. It was a very imperfect fit. Something like 30% of independence supporters voted to leave, and that union supporters and independent supporters voted equally to remain. That's changed. And so there's a linkage between these two constitutional questions, which is really very important. It means that the pro-independence vote is much more homogeneous than it was in the past. Another factor to bear in mind is the position of England. And some of us keep on coming back to the point that the future of the Union will not be decided in Scotland or even in Northern Ireland, but in England. And we need to pay attention to what does opinion in England think about this. If it is a matter of political game playing and the Conservatives in the UK level and SNP on the other hand, trying to do things that will maximize political support and being constrained by the political risks in operating in various ways, obviously a prime minister who takes a gamble on a referendum and loses it would have to resign. It would be a disgrace. But the cost, it's not evident that there will be a massive cost to the Conservative Party in doing that. We look at opinion in England, compared with other cases, it's surprisingly relaxed about the independence of Scotland. And indeed, some polls have shown strikingly that amongst Leave supporters in England, there's a willingness to accept the secession of Scotland as well as Northern Ireland as the price for Brexit. So there's not that domestic electoral constraint that you find in a place like Spain. So British prime ministers do have a degree of maneuvering here. Finally, what is the alternative? It does seem now we've got a polarization between independence and union meaning the status quo. Historically, there's been a huge middle ground between those two positions, whether you call it Devo Max or federalism or whatever. A plurality of voters in Scotland have long supported something more than we've got and less than independence. That middle ground is shifting. And the surveys are now showing that, partly as a result of Brexit, because either you're in or out of the European Union, but also because of the increasing coincidence between voting SNP, feeling very Scottish, supporting independence and wanting to remain in Europe. These were three circles in the past which were not concentric. Now they're very much the same thing. So electorally, that middle ground is shifting. Also, it's very difficult to see what could usefully be conceded by way of further powers to Scotland that would address this problem. You could have a few more powers, but everybody accepts that which was tried after 2014 is not the trick. The trick is really about rethinking the union in a very profound way, and that would require the consent of England and other parts of the United Kingdom that's likely not to be forthcoming. The same applies to federalism. So we are in a polarized situation that we haven't been in for a very long time. It's union or not union. That is going to have to be resolved at some point. Of course, once that's resolved and we either vote to stay in the UK or to leave the UK, we'll all have to come back together again. We'll all have to put together some form of union. And as being in the case of Brexit, it will have to be a negotiation of how the people of these islands fit together. So we may end up somewhere in that middle ground. But to get there, it seems we've got to go through this independence exercise all over again.
Thank you very much, Michael, for all these very interesting thoughts. So, and I think that Nicola will jump on the question, union or not union. And so I will leave the floor to Nicola, who is a professor of territorial politics. And we will talk also about this impact of Brexit on the domestic politics of independence and any potential threat of the devolved settlement with Brexit. So I will leave you the floor now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Kathy. It's very lovely to be with you, virtually at least. I share, I think, the view that both Fiona and Michael expressed, that devolution has broadly destabilized the union. It has exposed a fragmentation in political attitudes and preferences and the relationship with Europe that was already there, but it's exposed it and it's reinforced it. It's also exposed the challenge of managing a plurinational state when one of the constituent territories is so much larger than all the others in population terms, and by consequence, so much larger in terms of its political power. We saw that, first of all, and most explicitly in the Brexit referendum itself, when it was a UK-wide ballot, and as a UK-wide ballot, it was unable to reflect the plurinational diversity that it was evident in the voting patterns. But you asked me, I think, to focus more on how Brexit has affected devolution in the first instance, and then I'll maybe come on to the challenges around independence towards the end. For me, and I'm building here, I think, on what Fiona was saying, that the Brexit process has revealed the extent to which EU membership had been quite implicitly important in providing a supranational framework within which devolution was introduced and developed, both discursively in terms of identities and making it easier to have multiple identities within the same state, to be British and Scottish, to be British and Irish in particular, and also by providing a regulatory framework that helped to foster cross-border mobility within the internal market, and also to some extent contain some of the policy divergences between the administrations of the UK that might otherwise have emerged. So all of that the Brexit process has shone a light on all of that and created a number of challenges that did need to be confronted. Talk maybe first of all about intergovernmental relations, because the system of intergovernmental relations in the UK, the relations of the machinery and processes of relationships between the administrations is comparatively very weak. And it was never really seen as much of a problem until you started to get more complex devolution arrangements, which predated the Brexit referendum, but also in particular in light of the Brexit process, and because of, as Fiona was mentioning, the intersection between devolved competences and EU competences, and when these were repatriated from the EU to the UK, it was creating a set of challenges and a set of questions about whether you needed to replace some of those EU frameworks with UK-wide or GB frameworks, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But the negotiations themselves fell into the category of reserved competence in the sense that external relations was a reserved matter. But there has always been a recognition that EU relations in particular had an impact on devolved matters. And so there was always a recognition from the outset of devolution that the devolved institutions had a legitimate voice in that process. And Theresa May, when she first took over the role as Prime Minister, recognised that and responded to it. And a new forum was created to give the devolved governments an opportunity to be part of the Brexit negotiation process. This was called the Joint Ministerial Committee for EU Negotiations, set up in 2016, with a remit that was far different from anything that had preceded it. It was set up to discuss each of the government's requirements, to seek to agree a UK approach to Brexit, and to give the devolved governments oversight of the negotiations. So it raised a lot of expectations about the devolved government's role in the Brexit process. And there were an awful lot of meetings, far more than we had seen in intergovernmental arena before. But more meetings does not equal more influence. And having raised the expectations, it fundamentally failed to meet those expectations. The whole process was very frustrating, very chaotic from the perspective of the devolved governments. And over Brexit negotiations themselves, they had really zero influence over the shape that those negotiations took. And we saw that in the outcome of both the withdrawal agreement and the agreement that replaced it. Sorry, then the new UK-EU deal. So where they did have a little bit more influence was on the domestic side, the domestic preparations for Brexit. And in particular, that process of the repatriation of competences. The UK government's initial inclination was to re-centralise everything, to keep control within Westminster, including in those areas of EU law that were in devolved areas, until they decided whether or not there needed to be a new UK law instead of the EU law. But that created an awful lot of opposition across political parties, the Scottish and Welsh governments working together, the parliaments coming together, a lot of support mobilised against that explicit re-centralisation of power. And the UK government backtracked. They did provide themselves with a legal device called Section 12 Orders of the EU Withdrawal Act to exercise, to use secondary legislation to temporarily freeze devolved competences if they felt the need to. Those powers have never been used, and instead the governments worked together collaboratively, very much a joint exercise, to explore whether they needed common frameworks. Now, these might be legislative frameworks, or they might be more in the form of intergovernmental agreements. So agreements where they would work collaboratively and have a broad common framework within which they would all operate. And the idea here was to minimize the extent to which, not minimize divergence as such, but to minimize the extent to which having policies conducted differently in different parts of the UK would create new barriers within the UK that wouldn't have otherwise been there under EU regulations. And these tend to be quite technical. So some of the frameworks that have been agreed are around hazardous substances, food and feed safety and hygiene law, food compositional standards and labelling. So it's really quite technical and precise, and there are always political dimensions to these, but they tend to be more in the sort of apolitical arena. Not all of them. Public procurement is a little bit more political, missions trading and so on. But mostly it was quite narrowly focused, quite technical. And actually, as part of that process of joint working and exploring common frameworks, they reduced significantly the number of areas as to where they thought there was a need for something like this. So it started out that there was 154 areas of EU law that were identified as intersecting with devolved competence in one or more of the administrations. And they got it down to around about 30, where they thought there was a need for some sort of common framework. But under the current administration, that work has continued, but alongside it has been a much more centralizing, assertive approach, and in particular evident in legislation that was passed at the end of December called the UK Internal Market Act. The idea here is that as the UK leaves the EU internal market, it needs legislative underpinning for its own domestic market so as to avoid barriers to trade and mobility within the United Kingdom. And this was deeply opposed by the Scottish and Welsh governments and did not secure consent from the Northern Ireland Assembly either. And it puts into place two market access principles of mutual recognition and non-discrimination, so as to avoid barriers to trade. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with those principles. They are quite common to internal markets, but in the way in which it was done in this case, and the effect of it is to change the territorial reach of devolved laws. So it doesn't change the ability of the devolved institutions to make the laws as they see fit, but it does limit their ability to apply them, because the principle of mutual recognition in particular means that if, for example, the Scottish government, picking an issue from the SNP manifesto here, wants to set new standards on housing, it can apply those to builders that are based in Scotland and regulated in Scotland, but it cannot apply them to builders who are regulated in another part of the United Kingdom. It spills over into trade deals too. If a trade agreement is reached that allows food to be imported into the UK with lower standards than are already existing here, there is nothing that the devolved institutions can do to maintain higher standards for food that is then crossing the border and traded within Scotland. So all of that is causing deep concern about the authority of the devolved institutions. We can maybe talk a wee bit more about that in the discussion. So finally then, just looking ahead, like Michael, I have no crystal ball. I do not know what is going to happen here. What are the options? Well, all of the options, it seems to me, are problematic. There is the option of further devolution, further home rule, possibly even a UK-wide framework around federalism. There is space to do some of that, but there isn't, it seems to me, the political appetite to do it. There is space for more co-decision, but again, there is no evidence of political will for that to happen. There is some evidence of re-centralisation or at least an assertive unionism on the part of the UK government, but the consequences of that are unclear and it's very unlikely, I think, to buy loyalty if that is indeed the intention. But independence too is not inevitable, and not only does it currently split opinion within Scotland and divide Scotland down the middle, but it has also been made more complex by the Brexit process, not least at the border between Scotland and England. And perhaps we'll get on to talking about Irish unity debates in the discussion as well. So it seems to me that the most likely outcome is a prolonged stalemate. And I don't think that's particularly healthy for UK democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very detailed explanation and all these thoughts about recentralization, unionization, further devolution, and statu quo. So if the audience wants to start asking questions, make comments, I think that I see that we already have one, but do not hesitate to use the chat. I will ask the question directly to our guests in 1 minute, but maybe if Fiona, Nicola, or Michael, you want to react to each other's thoughts. You already started the dialogue between you. Maybe not Fiona, if you want, as you were talking first, or if you want to react on Nicola's and Michael's thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much again. Yes, well, that was been really fascinating. I was particularly interested in the way that there seems to be a conflict in understanding between the British government on the one hand having a very sort of centralist understanding of the Union, and the devolved governments having a plurinational understanding of the Union. Yeah, so I was wondering really to what extent the EU Withdrawal Act sort of emphasized this difference, because this is something that I think both Michael and Nicola mentioned.
Michael, Nicola, if you want to react.
I muted myself, as I always remember to mute myself. I never remember to unmute myself. But what I was going to say is that there's always been this ambivalence about the nature of the Constitution. And in Westminster in England, it's regarded as a unitary state. In the periphery, it never has been. And this can be infuriating at some times, but other times it can be seen as quite helpful to the Union, because there's no need for a shared understanding of the foundations of the Constitution. And most of the time, we managed to get around that. The same applied to the UK's relationship with the European Union, because the UK government never actually accepted the supremacy of EU law or that it affected sovereignty, but it never picked a fight about it. It always found a way to get around it. That's how it's worked there. That has become more difficult because of the rise of nationalism, both Scottish, Welsh, Irish nationalism, but also a kind of British nationalism, addressed to the EU, but also addressed internally. And unionists in the United Kingdom never really came to terms with devolution, because before devolution, they could concede all kinds of symbolic rights to the constituent nation. Scotland wants to call itself a nation. Fine, it's got its own ecclesiastical settlement. Fine, the Queen changes her religion when she crosses the border and becomes a Calvinist and believes in predestination. All of these anomalies made the Union work. But this has become increasingly politicized and increasingly charged. And where the Unionists held the line was on absolute parliamentary sovereignty and no subordinate legislatures, because that would somehow interfere with parliamentary sovereignty. Very similar to the attitude to Europe. Yes to Europe, but nothing to do with the politics or the supranational elements of that. Devolution then exposed that, because once the Unionists had lost the argument about subordinate legislatures, the sovereignty issue was out of the back. This was there. It was waiting to happen. Was devolution a recognition of the inherent rights of the constituent nations, or was it simply kind of municipal government powers lent to the periphery? So that issue that had always been there became a live one, and unionism then had to reinvent itself. So what is this union all about? If it's not just about parliamentary sovereignty, if there's something more to it. At the same time, the myth of parliamentary sovereignty was blown, because, as I said before, it's a bit of an empty doctrine. And you had to justify the union. The union, for the first time, had to justify itself faced with nationalism. And so we got all this Britishness and British nation building that has spilled over into the post-Brexit period with what I call the new unionism. Some people talk about muscular unionism or assertive unionism, but it's trying to invent the union as a nation, as a unitary nation. It's become a form of nationalism itself. And that is really highly problematic. That was just waiting to happen, that conflict, but then Brexit really precipitated it. And then the thinking in London was revealed by all these pieces of legislation, because there was UK Withdrawal Act. Civil servants and ministers in London just said, oh, we'll take all the powers back to Westminster. Of course, that's the easiest thing to do, without realizing it had major constitutional implications. And similarly, other piece of Brexit legislation. The next issue coming up, by the way, is about human rights and whether we should get out of the direct application of the European Convention on Human Rights. And every time people in London come back to it, they forget that this just doesn't work in a plurinational state. So Brexit then has precipitated a lot of tensions that were always present in the United Kingdom, and particularly since devolution, but which hitherto politicians have managed to work around.
Can I just say, I agree with all of that, and I think in terms of the ambiguity, I think that's been particularly the case in relation to Northern Ireland, and it's often talked about in terms of the Good Friday Agreement being full of constructive ambiguity. Well, a lot of that is being exposed now, and in particular in the application of the protocol, and the difficulties of reconciling the different commitments made in the Good Friday Agreement and the UK government's desire to have that very different kind of relationship with the European Union. On the idea of a plurinational state, I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting in the context of COVID is the extent to which we've seen this emergence of a four nations discourse. So Prime Minister seems to be quite comfortable with talking about a four nations approach in relation to COVID governance, considerably less comfortable with some things that might go along with that in a federal type system, for example, which might involve co-decision or sharing power between those constituent territories. So it's the marrying of the symbolism that Michael talked about with the centralization of power that I think is exposing some of the fragilities here.
Thank you very much to both of you. I will maybe use the questions from the chats, and if we have still some time, you can still react and talk to each other. So the first question is it's quite a long one. So the Scottish government and CNP leadership have placed a lot of emphasis on increased cooperation with the Nordic countries, moving toward the Nordic model in political and social terms, and having more influence on participating in the Arctic Council. How do you think they will play into future developments regarding Scotland's place in the UK and its possible move towards independence? So what about this cooperation with Nordic countries and Nordic model, and how it will influence Scotland and independence and Scottish independence? Fiona, do you want to take this question? Or Nicola, I saw that you unmute yourself.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, there's different aspects to this, I think. There is the sort of paradiplomacy aspect that the Scottish government has been looking to develop a profile on the international stage as a government of devolved Scotland. And we've seen that in a variety of different forums, but the Arctic example is one of those. And it's clearly trying to nurture the perception of Scotland as a Nordic nation, and the Nordic countries are looked to as positive examples of small independent states. I'm not sure how well informed that always is, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the diversity that we see across the Nordic countries. The Nordic Council of Ministers was also often talked about as something that might be emulated in the context of independence to foster relationships and increased coordination, not necessarily coordination, but at least cooperation in a British Isles context. Less so now than in 2014, but I think there's an awful lot of details still to be worked out in what the offer of independence for Scotland would look like and how it would situate itself in relation to its neighbours, both in the rest of the UK and in the Nordic countries.
I will maybe jump to the second question. So the second one is from Camille, asking, has or how has the European integration changed the nature of Scottish nationalism? So is there any impact of the European integration on Scottish nationalism? And if it is the case, how, to what extent?
Well, maybe I'll try to answer that. Well, I think it's not necessarily the nature of Scottish nationalism, but more the nature of the independence project that it has shaped, and that's part of the reason why the SNP adopted that policy of independence in Europe. It does give sort of a more sort of reassuring, safer framework for an independent Scotland. And as such, it's been quite a powerful argument that the SNP has used over the years. Of course, as I said, there's no certainty as to the outcome when it comes to membership of the EU of an independent Scotland. But certainly it is a powerful argument, and it gives this framework that maybe Scotland would lose if it were to become independent from the rest of the UK. And so that's why in that sense, I think it's more the independence project that it has affected.
Please go, Michael, please.
Could I come back on both of those and try to link them? There's been a lot of talk in Scottish nationalism since the 1950s, probably, about the Nordic model, small, social democratic, cohesive state. A lot of misunderstanding about it, a lot of lack of appreciation of the diversity within the Nordic country. We sort of know what we mean, but not a great willingness to accept the implications of that, notably high taxation. The internal change that would be required within Scotland, in civil society and in government, to have that kind of state. It's not just becoming independent that would do it. And a tendency to mix up the Nordic countries with other small countries and talk about small countries in general, when the experience of small countries is very, very different indeed. And this is what I did a book about this at the time of the independence referendum, pointing out that there are different models of small countries, and the Nordic model is just one of them. And the SNP would tend to mix and match them. And its Sustainable Growth Commission, published a few years ago, as the answer to all the questions that have been raised about the economic consequences of independence, does exactly that. We'll have a little bit of Denmark and a little bit of New Zealand and so on. And ultimately, I found it unconvincing, although it did for the first time accept that there would be a fiscal challenge for an independent Scotland. That debate really has not occurred in Scotland. It's just a vague reference point. On the question of the external relationships, yes, there's a lot of talk about small countries, but again, a lack of really serious work on the possibilities for small countries to act in the international arena. The Nordic Council used to be talked about until it was explained to people that the Nordic Council is not like the European Council. It is a very weak mechanism indeed, and you can't rely on that to achieve the kind of relationships that we want across these islands, even following independence. But also the attitude of the Nordic countries to the EU has been very standoffish. Either they're not in, like Sweden, or they get as many opt-outs as the UK, like Denmark does, or there's somehow distance in the case of Sweden. Whereas in independent Scotland, I would argue, if it's going to work in Europe, it's got to be at the centre. It's got to be more like Ireland, which is a very active player in Europe, is at the centre of absolutely everything, rather than Nordic countries that are a little bit standoffish and they're on the edge, because you can be a big country on the edge of Europe. You can be a small country at the heart of Europe, but being a small country at the edge of Europe is very problematic, particularly in the rather weak position that Scotland is, and with a very dominant and powerful neighbour. You're going to require a lot of Europe to offset the effect of the United Kingdom. So these things, these debates have not taken place in Scotland. It really is quite extraordinary. And it's really important that next time around, because there probably will be a next time around, that more work is done on this. This is the sort of thing that Nicola and I tried to do all those years in the centre, raise these kinds of questions. We don't care what decision you take, but you should make a decision based upon the evidence that we have.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Nicola, please.
No, it's just to sort of build on that and maybe flip it a little bit, because one of the things that's interesting is that's not just how the Scottish independence movement perceives the EU, but how the EU perceives the Scottish independence movement. And I think in 2014, and Fiona made reference to some of the interventions that we saw from the Commission and the Council at that time, that there seemed to be somewhere between puzzlement and antipathy to the prospect of independence as somehow a contradiction to the process of European integration. It was, you know, something that was pulling apart rather than coming on board and integrating further. And that I don't think was ever really an accurate understanding of the independence movement and project in 2014, but Brexit seems to have changed that. I think there is a bit more understanding in Brussels now about the European dimension of the independence project. And actually, I think that European dimension is a bit more explicit now because of Brexit, which might be political opportunity. It might just be that there's been a bit more thought put into it. But, and here's where I'm agreeing with Michael here, it's still not really clear what the independence leadership, the SNP leadership, wants from the EU, how it sees Scotland within the EU. On currency, for example, there is an extraordinary reluctance to think about the euro and being part of the Eurozone and to be open about the implications of not being, because that would, in a sense, put you on the outside of many of those critical discussions, and there'd be cost and benefits, but there's not really that that open debate about the different options and the different visions that you might have of the EU. So that I think is a mature discussion that still has to take place, and I would hope that it would be part of the many discussions that have to take place over the next few years before we get to another vote.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And Fiona, you wanted to, you raised your hand, so yes, I would give you the floor.
Yes, I just want to add that I think that there's a lot more sympathy towards Scotland in other European countries now because of the fact that Scotland, as a majority, voted to remain in the EU. And certainly, I think that it's raised the understanding abroad of the UK as four nations. It has helped many people to sort of place Scotland on the map. I mean, obviously, I'm speaking from a French perspective here because that's where I am. But it would appear that many people here have realised that, oh, wait a minute, Scotland was not an extension of England, and that the Scots voted differently, and that raised questions that people here have found very interesting. And there's a lot more sympathy. I think it's always that thing about, you know, your enemy, your common enemy, and so on. You know, is going to be rather the sort of this friendly understanding now of Scotland in France, and I'm sure in other European countries as well. So that has certainly helped, and it is certainly an advantage, I think, that the Scottish government will try to use. And on the other hand, the other issue that we haven't really mentioned so far is the border between England and Scotland, is because, of course, the SNP is going to have trouble formulating their European project in opposition to a sort of border with England. On the one hand, they will have to show sort of the benefits of applying for membership of the European Union if Scotland were to become independent, as outweighing the drawbacks of having now a hard border with England, and what that means in terms of trade, and people crossing borders for their jobs every day. I think that is going to be much more difficult than the arguments that they used to have when the UK was still member of the European Union. So I think it was easier to sort of present an independent Scotland reapplying for membership of the European Union in 2014 than it will be now, because this entails a hard border with England.
Yes, thank you very much for all this last thought, and I think you're totally right how to introduce things and how to introduce the benefits of leaving the UK to get access to the EU when you have a hard border, and when we think about all the difficulties between, it's not the same context, but having a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And so I think that all these questions of borders is really, really important and will play a key role in the future of union or not union. So I think we will stop here because we're a bit over time now, but thank you very much to the three of you, Fiona, Nicola, and Michael. It was very fascinating and very interesting chat with you, with a lot of different issues covered. So thank you very much for your time. And we will upload the video very soon on our website also for people who were not able to join us today. So thank you very much once again. And thank you everyone who attended this lecture, and see you soon.